The good news just keeps on coming for Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs as Michael Ajayi officially withdraws from the NBA draft, giving this team a top 5 roster in the country.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Folks, Michael Ajayi is officially a Gonzaga Bulldog. We're going to talk about what it means for Mark Few's team, whether this is the deepest roster that the Zags have had in the Mark Few era. Plus, we got some other NBA draft decisions to discuss and how they're going to impact Gonzaga to close out the show. But the big news, and we're not having to record this at 10 p.m. or the following morning, as we've had to do in previous years, because Michael Ajayi did not make us wait until the final seconds. The deadline to announce whether you are going to withdraw from the NBA draft process or stay in the process and therefore forego your college basketball eligibility is Wednesday, May 29th at 8:59 p.m. Pacific time, aka midnight, as the calendar flips to May 30th. In the years past, Drew Timme was the last player to make his announcement after his junior year, announcing he was coming back for his senior year. Anton Watson waited a while last year. Julian Strother waited a while. The Zags have a history of having players wait until the last possible second. It's typical, and we have seen this so far today as I'm recording this in the afternoon on Wednesday. The players who wait typically are coming back to school. Not just to troll their teams, although Drew Timme and Julian and those guys had a little fun doing so, but generally it's because they are waiting to get as much feedback as possible to make sure they're making the right decision. If a team is making a promise to a player, hey, we're going to take you in the first round, we're going to take you in the second round, those players tend to make their decision or make their announcement a little bit sooner. If it's the last day and you haven't heard anything, those players tend to come back to school. We've seen that today with Mark Sears from Alabama, with Caleb Love from Arizona, with Alex Karaban from UConn, a handful of kind of the best players that are still left in that kind of stay or go decision process. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them are returning to school. And the expectation was always that Michael Ajayi would come to Gonzaga. There was a lot of consternation in the last month or so by the fan base, people concerned about, why hasn't he said anything yet? He's still doing workouts. Like, that's just part of the process. That's just part of the process. Michael Ajayi was out working out with teams, living his dream, trying to get the best feedback, the best analysis, taking advantage of every single second that he was allowed to be in that process, to get that feedback, to gain that knowledge. It didn't mean that he was, trying desperately not to come to Gonzaga. He was trying to fulfill his dream of playing in the NBA when he made the decision, okay, I've gotten enough feedback. Presumably scouts and general managers and whomever told him, hey, we love your game. We like this. We don't like this. Here's where we want to see you improve, but we can't promise you that we'll select you. We can't promise you a two-way contract. We can't really, we're not in a position to make you any promises. That's my expectation as to what happened. And he ultimately made the decision to come back to school. And I've said this on the show a few times, and I'll say it again. I think a lot of it for Ajayi was wanting to see him play a higher level of competition. Again, Pepperdine and Gonzaga are obviously in the same conference, but Pepperdine, they don't play a strong non-conference schedule. They don't play in the NCAA tournament. Ajayi will get a chance to play against teams like UConn, against UCLA. He will get a chance to play the teams in the battle for Atlantis. He will play San Diego State. He will play in the NCAA tournament. Like, he will get more marquee games. I didn't even say Kentucky. He'll get Kentucky as well. Like, he will get a lot of marquee opportunities. He will play in a more NBA-style offense. Like, this is the right decision for Michael Ajayi. But boy, howdy, is it great news for Gonzaga as well. A little bit about Ajayi, in case, we've talked about so many new players for Gonzaga with Braden Smith and Emmanuel Inocente and Caleb Battle. Like, we may be needing a refresher on Michael Ajayi, who committed to Gonzaga out of the transfer portal before Gonzaga had even played their final game of the season. Gonzaga was still getting ready to play Kansas, getting ready to play Purdue after that before they and Michael Ajayi already said, yep, that's where I'm going to go next year if I don't go to the draft process. Ajayi is a 6'7" forward from Kent, Washington. He has 1 year of eligibility remaining. So regardless, Michael Ajayi is about to play his final year of college basketball. There will be no mystery after this season. He played 2 years at Pierce College, a community college in Washington area. He also played last year at Pepperdine. And at Pepperdine, it was his first year of Division I basketball. He started all 33 games for Lorenzo Romar and the Waves, played about 35 minutes a night, and was an all-WCC first-teamer, averaging a touch over 17 points per game. He averaged 9.9 rebounds and 1.9 assists. He shot about 47% on two-point shots, and he took 11 per game. He was a high-volume shooter, scorer, basket attacker for Pepperdine last year. He also shot 47% from three. That was on a much smaller volume of attempts, only 2.5 attempts per game. That's still a very good percentage to shoot from three, even with a lower volume like that. And right now, as it stands, the expectation is that Michael Ajayi will step directly into a starting role for the Gonzaga Bulldogs, effectively replacing Anton Watson. They're not exactly the same as players. Watson was a more versatile defensive player, although Ajayi's defense is a little bit hard to know because, frankly, Lorenzo Romar and Pepperdine do not run a very good defensive set, and it's hard to evaluate his defense in that system compared to what it's going to look like in Gonzaga's system. He's almost certainly not going to be Anton Watson defensively, and that's less of a knock on Ajayi and more of like Anton Watson was a generational type versatile defensive player for Gonzaga in his 5 years in Spokane. But the starting lineup for Gonzaga next year is very likely going to be Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, Michael Ajayi, Ben Gregg, and Graham Ike. That is the expectation. Again, it is the same starting five that Gonzaga had last year with Ajayi just replacing Anton Watson. Watson kind of played both the 3 and the 4. You could kind of argue him and Ben Gregg sort of alternated depending on the set, depending on what Gonzaga was doing, depending on the matchups with the opposing team. And that's more or less what I expect Michael Ajayi to do too. He's 6'7", he's 220 pounds, and he measured with a 7-foot wingspan. Michael Ajayi is big. He is a big, big dude. There is no doubt in my mind that he can play some small ball 4. And I kind of think that's going to be something we see potentially a fair amount from Michael Ajayi next year. Because Gonzaga added Caleb Battle, and they didn't add Caleb Battle to have him not play a significant role. Mark Few and the Zags have very frequently played 3-guard lineups with like a lot, like throughout games. Like it's not just a gimmicky lineup that they run. They play 3-guard lineups with regularity. You think back to that 2020-21 team that went to the national championship game. Jalen Suggs, Andrew Nembhard, and Joel Ajayi were very frequently all on the floor at the same time. That lineup included Corey Kispert, who was effectively a small forward, playing the 4 with Drew Timme at the 5. So 3 guards and then a wing playing the 4. I kind of think that's what we're going to see a lot of from Gonzaga next year. We're going to have Nembhard, Hickman, and Battle all playing at the same time. All those guys are very clearly guards. And then you have Michael Ajayi playing the 4, a guy who could be a 3 but is now playing the 4. And then you have Graham Ike at the 5. You could substitute Braden Huff in there. You could maybe play smaller lineups where you substitute Ben Gregg in as the 5 as well. I think when Ben Gregg's not on the floor, Michael Ajayi is probably playing the majority of the minutes at the 4. I don't think we see a lot of Braden Huff and Graham Ike together. And I don't think, I know we're still waiting on Diagne, the 17-year-old from Senegal who's playing for Real Madrid in Spain, who is allegedly very close to committing to Gonzaga for that 13th scholarship spot. Even if that does happen, I don't see him playing a significant role. You can hear more about that on Wednesday's episode of Locked On Zags. But ultimately, I think for Gonzaga, Ajayi is going to play a lot of 3. He's going to play a lot of 4. I don't think he's going to play 35 minutes per game like he did at Pepperdine. That would be very surprising just with Gonzaga's depth this year to see really anybody play up at 35 minutes per game. I think he's more in the 26, 27 minute per game range, and I think he's splitting them between the 3 and the 4 because Gonzaga has more depth at the 3 than they do at the 4. Outside of Ben Gregg, there's not a lot of depth at that power forward position. Jun-Suk Yeo is in the mix. He can play some 4. Again, if they land Diagne, he could potentially play some 4, although he's more of a 5. I don't think Huff and Ike, they're both pretty traditionally 5s in my mind. And then you have Steele Venters and Dusty Stromer, who are both going to be contributors for Gonzaga next year. You also have Emmanuel Inocente, who I think could play some minutes at the 3 as well. So you have a lot more depth at the 3 than the 4. So I think Ajayi ends up playing more power forward than small forward. I think looking at statistically, he's probably not going to average 17 and 10 again, in part because he's just not going to be the focal point offensively for Gonzaga the way he was for the Waves. But I would like to see the efficiency even tick up. Maybe use 47% on 2s. Maybe he's up 58% on 2s. Again, he's probably not going to take 11 2-point attempts per game. But if the efficiency ticks up, if the 3-point percentage, it doesn't need to dramatically improve from 47. That's really good. If he shoots between 45 and 50% from 3 on a similar or even slightly increased volume, that is excellent. And I'm certain that for Ajayi, that's something he wants to improve, or at least show scouts more that he can do that it's not a fluke, that it wasn't just a one-year wonder, that he's a consistent knockdown shooter. Because a 6'7" wing with a 7-foot wingspan who can consistently knock down three-pointers, that's an NBA draft prospect right there. And Ajayi wants to get back in that conversation. He wants to be in this position next year. Obviously, he can't return to school, but he wants to be in a position where he's talking to teams, he's talking to players and scouts, and getting serious attention as an NBA draft prospect. Coming back to Gonzaga and putting together very elite productivity while playing against high-level teams, while playing in the NCAA tournament, that's going to put him in that conversation. Incredible for Mark Few and the Zags. They're having a fantastic week to now get Michael Ajayi back in the mix permanently, to know that he's going to be at Gonzaga, not going anywhere else. He is going to be at Gonzaga is a huge deal for this team heading into next season. What I want to talk about now is how this impacts the rest of Gonzaga's roster. We talked about it a little bit, but let's kind of dig into that a little bit more. And a fun conversation. Is this the deepest roster that Mark Few has ever had at Gonzaga? We're going to talk about that in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, Game Time. Folks, it is minor league baseball season, and for me, I live about 10 minutes away from the Hillsboro Hops. I love getting a chance to check out those games, and I like being able to make a last-minute decision. I don't want to have to plan ahead. The nice thing about that is that Game Time is the perfect place to get those last-minute tickets, because prices on the Game Time app, they actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. And if you're somebody who worries about your tickets being fake and you're going to get turned away at the ticket booth, the best thing about Game Time is they have the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry, and I personally love having that peace of mind. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Folks, do you want to go to a Hillsboro Hops game? 2 tickets, about $25. You can get them for $5 if you use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off that first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, download the Game Time app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. We're still talking about the NBA draft deadline day decision by Michael Ajayi to return to college, in this case, the Gonzaga Bulldogs, where he has committed in the transfer portal. Ajayi being in the mix officially means Gonzaga has filled 12 of their 13 scholarship spots, as I am recording this at around 4 p.m. on Wednesday evening. The reason I timestamped that is because we had heard, and for those of you who listened to Wednesday's episode of Locked On Zags, you know that we talked about this, but Real Madrid center, 17-year-old named Ismaila Diagne, is reportedly in the mix for Gonzaga. There were some Spanish news outlets that already reported that Diagne had committed to Gonzaga. Theo Lawson, the spokesman review, talked to some people in Gonzaga's office, and they said, hey, it's not finalized yet. We're kind of barreling towards the finish line, but it's not done. So by the time you're listening to the show, it is possible that another announcement has come out that Diagne has committed to Gonzaga. If that's the case, hang tight. We'll talk about that on Friday's show, I promise. But that's going to finish out Gonzaga's roster if it happens. If it doesn't happen, it sounds like Gonzaga is in the mix to fill that final roster spot. If they don't land Diagne, perhaps they will look elsewhere for another international or another young big to kind of fill that final spot. For this roster, as it is currently constructed, and even with Diagne, everybody's going to be able to play except Braden Smith. Braden Smith, the conversations that have been had are that he is going to redshirt this year. He'll have 2 years of eligibility to replace Ryan Nembhard as the team's starting point guard starting in the 2025-26 season. He will be a scholarship player for Gonzaga this year. He will be busting his butt in practices, making Ryan and Nolan better, learning the offense, getting ready to take the reins in 2025-26. But he will not be participating for Gonzaga this year. Everybody else, the expectation is that they will. We haven't heard any confirmation that anybody else is planning to redshirt. Typically, they don't make those decisions ahead of time, but it's possible as we get closer to September and October. I think some of the stuff they're waiting on is potentially seeing how Steel Venters continues to recover from his injury, if he's 100%, if he's full go, they may start to look at, are there other players that we want to potentially, toss a red shirt on? Whether it's Emmanuel Inocente from Tarleton State, whether it's Diagne, if he does commit to Gonzaga, do they, talk to him about potentially redshirting? Whether it's Jun-Suk Yo, who I don't think that would be a conversation with him necessarily, but perhaps he would value an extra year of eligibility rather than being buried on the bench, which is unfortunately going to be the situation that he finds himself in coming into this year. But ultimately, the Steel Venters' health is kind of the biggest factor right now. It's not really being discussed because there's not really any need to. Mark Few's not giving media updates anytime in the offseason, but everything we've heard is that Steel Venters' recovery from his ACL injury is going well. But these recoveries tend to take close to a year, if not an entire year. And again, Steel didn't get hurt last summer. He tore his ACL in November. He tore his ACL on a day that this year, that same day, exactly 1 year later, Gonzaga will probably have already played a game, or at least they'll be in the conversation. I believe it was November 8th that we got the announcement that Steel Venters had torn his ACL. So if he's 100% in exactly a year, he would just barely be ready to be full go for the start of the season. If there's any kind of setback, or even if it's just like, hey, the recovery's going well, it's just a 14-month recovery, all of a sudden you're talking about January. I want to be clear. I don't know. I'm not speculating, and I'm not trying to. I don't know. I don't know the situation on Steel Venters as he recovers from his injury, but it is possible that he is not 100% at the start of the season. Gonzaga obviously has the depth to handle that. With now Michael Ajayi in the mix, he's going to play the 3. Emmanuel Inocente can play the 3. Obviously, Dusty Stromer can play the 3. You have the 3 guards that we're expecting to play on the floor at the same time. Like, there is not Steel Venters, if he's not 100% and is kind of getting eased back into action. That's not a bad thing for Gonzaga at all. In fact, it's probably for the best for everybody involved that he doesn't get rushed into that situation and kind of get his bearings straight, get comfortable with game action before he's thrust into a bigger role. What I want to talk about now is whether this is Mark Few's deepest team ever, because the depth on this team is absolutely unbelievably insane. I have Steel Venters, since we were talking about him, penciled in as the 9th man. Mark Few doesn't usually play 9 guys. With the starting lineup of E.K. Gregg, Ajayi, Hickman, Nemhard, your 6th man is Caliph Battle, who's a guy who averaged double digits at Arkansas last year in the SEC, who dropped 42 points against Vanderbilt in a game last year. Your 7th man is Braden Huff, who looked outstanding last year coming off the bench, had multiple 20-point games early in the year. Your 8th man is Dusty Stromer, who started for Gonzaga last year for the first part of the season, a top 50 freshman in his recruiting class. Then your 9th guy is Steel Venters again. He was Big Sky Player of the Year over Dalton Connect, who was an All-American and is probably going to be one of the first 10 players selected in the 2024 NBA draft. Your 10th man is Emmanuel Inocente, who was an All-WAC freshman last year, who played 32 minutes per game for a team that finished second in a pretty good mid-major conference. Your 11th guy is Jun-Suk Yo, who admittedly didn't look great last year, but is a player that there was a lot of excitement about and that could be a valuable piece going forward. If Diagne commits, he's your 12th man. And he's a guy who was one of the youngest EuroLeague starters ever. It's like him and Luka Doncic in terms of youngest starters in the EuroLeague in the last couple of years. That is incredible for him to be potentially your 11th or 12th man on this roster. This team is insanely, ridiculously, overwhelmingly deep heading into next season. You look at other teams that Gonzaga's had that are possibly in the conversation for deepest of all time. There's 2 teams. And they're the 2 teams that went to the national championship game. The 2016-17 roster that lost to North Carolina and the referees, and the 2020-2021 team that lost to Scott Drew and the Baylor Bears. No referees there. Baylor just took Gonzaga down in that contest. But those are the 2 deepest teams in Gonzaga basketball history. And this team, frankly, compares favorably to them. You look at that 16-17 team, their front court, Shemet Karnowski, Jonathan Williams, Zach Collins, Killian Tilly. Your backcourt for that team was Nigel Williams-Goss, Josh Perkins, Jordan Matthews, and Silas Melson. That team also had some kid named Rui Hachimura as a 9th man. He didn't play much that year. He was still pretty raw, but he was on that team. Brian Alberts was on that team. Ryan Edwards was a depth center for that team. And then Jeremy Jones, who ultimately carved out a quality career for Gonzaga in the next couple of years after that. That's a really deep 12-man roster, but it's kind of comparable to this Gonzaga team. You can see Mark Few trying to put together a roster that looks similar in a lot of ways. Both teams had a dominant low-post anchor in Karnowski and Graham Ike. Both teams had 2 veteran point guards starting in Nigel Williams-Goss and Josh Perkins. And then, of course, this year, Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman. Both teams had transfer wings who had veteran experience who slotted right into a starting role. That would be Jordan Matthews and Michael Ajayi. Both had tough veteran bigs who had shooting touch, Jonathan Williams and Ben Gregg. Both had a quality young big coming off the bench, Zach Collins, and then, of course, now Braden Huff. Both had a quality scoring guard coming off the bench as well in Silas Melson, who averaged about 7.5 in that year for Gonzaga. And then, of course, Caleb Battle for this year's team. A lot of similarities, some differences as well. That team had 4 quality bigs. Gonzaga this year doesn't really have a 4th big, the way that Killian Tilly kind of filled that role for that 16-17 team. But otherwise, I think there's a lot of similarities. And of course, Venters and Stromer weren't even really involved in this comparison. So they kind of fill that Killian Tilly type role for that 16-17 team. Comparisons for 2020-21 are similar as well. Drew Timme, Corey Kispert, Anton Watson, Umar Ballo was your front court for that team. Jalen Suggs, Joel Ajayi, Andrew Nembhard, and Aaron Cook was your backcourt. You also had the rest of the tricky trio, Julian Strother and Dominic Harris, and Ben Gregg, who joined that team halfway through the year because of COVID canceling his high school basketball season. So again, some similarities. Drew Timme and Graham Ike, your dominant low post centers. Corey Kispert and Michael Ajayi kind of fill in that small ball 4 role in both sides. Your backcourt of Jalen Suggs and Andrew Nembhard compared to Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman. And then, of course, you have your Joel Ajayi filling that kind of 3rd guard role, but also starting or playing big minutes. Caleb Battle's not going to start for Gonzaga, but he kind of fills that 3rd guard role as well. So a lot of similarities in how these rosters are constructed. It's hard to argue that this Gonzaga roster, as it's currently constructed, whether or not they land Diagne or not, is as deep as Gonzaga's ever been. I mean, it truly is. If they're healthy, if they play at expectation next year, this is the deepest Gonzaga roster ever. Does it mean they're going to win a championship? I don't know. Does it mean they're going to go to the championship? I don't know. But the last 2 times that Gonzaga's been this deep and this talented, they did. So if anybody out there who's ruling them out, any media who's kind of dismissing the offseason Gonzaga's had so far, I think there's going to be a lot of crow eating happening in March of 2025 because this team is built to be as good or maybe even better as the 2 teams that Gonzaga's had that have gone all the way to the Big Dance Championship. Well, folks, the NBA draft deadline saw many decisions that will impact the Zags next season, not just Michael Ajayi returning to school. We're going to talk about what those are in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're still talking NBA draft deadline decision day. Players who are staying, players who are going. We know that Michael Ajayi is coming back to Gonzaga. That's the big storyline for Spokane, Washington. But what are some other players who have made decisions in the last 24 hours or so and how they might impact Gonzaga basketball next season? The first one, I talked about this very briefly on Wednesday's show, but I'll give it a little bit more time here. San Francisco, the Dons lost Jonathan Mogbo. He was their best player last year. Fantastic transfer portal addition coming over from Missouri State, a guy who averaged like 8.7 boards at Missouri State. He transfers to San Francisco, blossoms into one of the best bigs in the entire conference, one of the best mid-major bigs in the entire country. Mogbo averaged 14.2 points, 10.1 rebounds, and 3.6 assists last year for the Dons. He was a huge portal additions, and he tested really well at the combine. He did phenomenal in the scrimmages. We've seen him rocket up mock drafts. He wasn't on a lot of mock drafts. All of a sudden, the mock drafts started coming out, having him in the 50s. Some started having him in the 40s, in the mid-second round, the early second round. When you start to see a lot of smoke there, typically there's fire, and that was the case here as Mogbo decided to stay in the NBA draft process, forego his college basketball eligibility, ends up being a one-and-done guy for San Francisco. And this is it's not good news in the immediate future for San Francisco. Obviously, losing your star player when you didn't really have an opportunity to replace him. I know San Francisco has brought in some depth in the front court already, so they maybe had a sense that this would happen. But if you're San Francisco now, your ability to recruit in the transfer portal and even recruit out of high school, it goes up when you start putting dudes in the league. When guys start coming to your program and instantly improving in every facet and then turn into NBA players, more players are going to want to transfer to your program. So this is not good news for San Francisco in the short term, but it is great news for Chris Gerlison and the Dons in the long term. Sticking with the WCC, the new look WCC, I should say, Jaylen Wells is staying in the NBA draft process out of Washington State. Now, Wells had already entered the transfer portal, And considering basically everybody from last year's team on Washington State was in the portal or had already departed the program, it seemed very unlikely that Wells was going to return to Wazoo as they transition into the WCC to play for a new coach in David Riley. So I don't know that this is really newsworthy in the sense that it's not the first time we're finding out that Jaylen Wells isn't going to play for Wazoo next year. I know Kentucky had been pursuing him in the portal. There's a handful of other really high-profile programs that were looking at him. But he's opted to stay in the draft process. So he's not going to be playing college basketball anymore at all. 12.5 points last year for the Cougars, as well as 4.5 boards. Shot 42% from three, was a Sonoma State junior college transfer, or D2 transfer, I should say, who came to Washington State for 1 year. Really, really successful kid for the Cougars last year. Sad to see him not in the conference, but not surprised to see him staying in that draft process. A couple non-WCC updates. Alex Karaban has returned to the UConn Huskies. I mentioned this earlier in the show briefly. Like Caleb Love, like Mark Sears coming back to their respective schools at Arizona and Alabama, respectively. Karaban returns to UConn. It's a bit of a surprise. He was kind of 50-50 on what he was going to do. He's a rising junior, a rising redshirt junior for UConn. He's just won back-to-back national championships. He was a starter each of the last 2 seasons for the Huskies. When you're a projected first or at least comfortable second-round pick, you've already won back-to-back national championships. Those guys don't typically come back to school. Case in point, Karaban is the only starter from UConn's team last year who will be back. 2 of them were out of eligibility. Tristan Newton, their starting point guard, Cam Spencer, their starting shooting guard. Those guys were out of eligibility. Stephon Castle was always going to be a one and done. Donovan Clingan was pretty much penciled in as a lottery pick as soon as Adama Sanogo left UConn after last season. So it's no surprise that Clingan, Castle, Spencer, and Newton are gone. But Karaban decided to come back, despite being mocked in the first round. Despite coming back to a roster that doesn't have a lot of the same faces. He's got basically all of their reserves last year. Hassan Diarra's back, Solomon Ball's back, Samson Johnson's back. Like, they got some talent still on that roster. They also, of course, added Aiden Mahaney from St. Mary's. They added Liam McNeely, who was a freshman player that Gonzaga had pursued. He's an incoming freshman. He's really, really talented. He'd been at Indiana, or been committed to Indiana, decommitted from there. Now he's at UConn. So this UConn team's going to be good next year. I don't think they're going to be as good as the last 2 years, but again, that's less of an insult to this current UConn roster and more of they just won back-to-back national championships. Of course, they're not going to be quite as good as having done that, but Karaban coming back is a huge storyline for UConn. He slots in alongside McNeely, alongside Mahaney, alongside Samson Johnson and Diarra. Terrace Reed, a transfer from Michigan, is going to be in the mix in the front court as well. This UConn team is going to be good. It matters for Gonzaga because they're playing them on December 14th at the Madison Square Garden. Basketball's mecca. It's going to be a fantastic non-conference game, a chance to play the 2-time defending champs, a chance to get another crack at Aiden Mahaney, who played Gonzaga well the last 2 years at St. Mary's. It's going to be a really fun game, and Karaban being back in the mix only serves to make UConn better and make that basketball game more exciting. As I'm recording right now, this exact moment, we still have not heard an update on former Gonzaga Bulldog Hunter Sallis. Sallis is one of the last kind of best remaining players who has not formally announced whether he is staying in the draft or returning to Wake Forest for his senior season. I expect, and by the time you're listening to this, you probably already know the answer, but I expect Hunter Sallis to stay in the draft process. He averaged 18 points a game last year for Wake Forest. He shot 40.5% from three on over 5 3-point attempts per game. This guy was a 26% three-point shooter at Gonzaga. For him to have exploded offensively, to be all ACC, to average 18 points a game, to shoot 40% from three, you have to capitalize on that. And for me, going to the draft process, he's projected as a second-round pick in many different places. If there are scouts and GMs telling him, hey, we got you, you're so-and-so on our board, you're 45th on our board, whatever it may be, if you're around at this pick, we'd like to pick you, etc. If he's feeling like he's getting that kind of promise, that kind of guarantee, or at least like multiple teams saying, hey, we'd like to be able to pick you in this draft, I think you got to go. And I know NIL is a factor. He can make good money at Wake Forest. He comes back, helps try to lead that team to an NCAA tournament. But I think it makes sense for him to go. Again, by the time you're listening to this, maybe he's already made that decision, in which case, super happy for Hunter. Seriously, super happy for him. It didn't work for him at Gonzaga. It's very rare for players to not pan out at Gonzaga. Like, it just doesn't happen very often. Umar Ballo is an example, but he was just buried behind really good bigs, and he went to follow the coach who recruited him, Tommy Lloyd, over to Arizona. Sallis is kind of one of the best examples of a guy who thrived elsewhere after not thriving at Gonzaga. And it happened. It's going to happen more. Every team has players like this. Gonzaga was in a position where they really hadn't had this happen. And to see it happen for him, I'm nothing but happy for him, excited to see where his career takes him, whether it's another year in the ACC with Wake Forest or whether he's an NBA draft pick next year. Happy to root for him going forward. It's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. It has been a week full of great news with Braden Smith, with the recruitment of Diagne out of Real Madrid, now with Michael Ajayi returning to school. What an incredible offseason. We're going to talk about that on Friday's show. Is this the best offseason of Mark Few's career? We'll have that. We'll have more updates on Diagne and everything else going on in college basketball very soon. Thanks again for listening. And until next time, as always, go Zags.